prepared in the industry and transported with a railway to the place where it should be constructed. But when they got all these proposals, they realized one year is a little bit less time to check all the proposals to decide who should do it, and it was like sometimes in the present time as well that they decided to give this job to the architects Brunel, Paxton, and the Stevenson brothers, and they realized the Crystal Palace. So they planned from the beginning a building which could destruct it after the exposition. So it should not be a building which should be there the whole time till today. They wanted to destruct it. It was part of the concept, and the elements they took were wood, glass, and iron. So here is the ground plot of it. The length of this building was 1,851 feet. It's about 560 meters, and it should symbolize the year of the construction, 1851. So the building was a kind of revolution, because they didn't say, okay, I want to go to the Hyde Park and I build up the Crystal Palace, so every plane had to be cut. They wanted to integrate all the plans, and for example, there were lots of elm trees in the Hyde Park, and they integrated it into the glass hole, how you can see on this picture. It's a very nice and very interesting concept, I think. And this building was a model of different exposition halls, for example, in Dublin and Munich. This is a picture of a Crystal Palace in Munich they built up. And after the destruction in the Hyde Park, they built it up in the periphery of London, but unfortunately, I think in 1926 or something like this, it burned down, so it doesn't exist anymore. So after London, there were a period of more exhibitions. After London, it was in Paris, then again in London, then Vienna, Paris, Philadelphia, and Paris again. So you can see that at this period, the kind of capital of world exhibitions was London and Paris. And I think the reason is that in London it was the start of the Industrial Revolution, and the industrialization started in England. So this might be the reason why in London and Paris were so many world exhibitions in this area. So as an example, I want to introduce you in the World Exhibition of Philadelphia. The special attraction was the arm of the Statue of Liberty with a torch. You can see it here. So they just installed it in the Philadelphia World Exhibition, and it's interesting situation. I didn't know it before I prepared this presentation. The statical constructions were made by Gustave Eiffel. Maybe I think everybody knows Eiffel because he constructed the famous Eiffel Tower, and he was the one when he made the whole construction for the Statue of Liberty. And some years later in Paris there was another world exhibition, and they showed the head of the Statue of Liberty. The Statue of Liberty was a present of the French people to the United States, and it was inaugurated in the New York Harbor in 1886. So you can see they planned it very early, and it was a very big attraction that the torch was shown in Philadelphia, and later the head was shown in Paris. Yeah, and the success you can imagine when you see the visitors at the beginning in the first World Exhibition in London attended 17,000 visitors. It's also very much when you imagine that it was the first World Exhibition. But later, after 50 years later, you can see in St. Louis, 1904, there were nearly 50 million visitors. So you can see all the visitors accepted it. It was a very big event, and the typical feature or character of the World Exhibition was that there was an increase in globalization of the themes. So at the beginning, the themes were typically the industrialization, the electric lights, or communication medias like telephone or radio or something like this. But later, there were some other aspects, for example, the historical aspect from Japan. They introduced their cultures, so this was very typical in this time. So all nations took their own culture and presented it to the world. So to Philadelphia, I introduced you. There is something, another aspect to tell. Till Philadelphia, it was like a big hall, like a big museum, and every nation had a kind of presentation table or something like this, a space for presentation. It was a little bit like a museum. And since Philadelphia, they changed the concept. So every nation got an own pavilion. So it was like a village of pavilions, and every nation had an own pavilion. Everybody could make a design and architectural concept for that. This was very typical, and this led into an increase of the globalization. So in the next period, where there were for other world expositions, in Sydney, Melbourne, Antwerpen is in Belgium, and again in Melbourne. These were also pretty interesting, but not as important as the one I showed you before, and I want to introduce you next. So the next very famous world exhibition, maybe the most famous world exhibition, was in Paris. 1889, Gustave Eiffel constructed the Eiffel Tower, and the Eiffel Tower was dedicated to the 100th anniversary of the French Revolution. Very important day for the French Revolution. Is a very important historical date in France till today, and the most amazing attraction was the height of this building was 300 meters. So it was at that time the highest building of the world at all. And before, the highest building was a cathedral in Ulm. Ulm is a village, not a village, a town in Germany, but it was just only 150 meters, and now there was a building 300 meters. It was very amazing and very exciting, of course, for the French people. And all these, the material was completely produced in factories, so Gustave Eiffel let it transported to that place, and he constructed it directly there. And like always, when something is very amazing, when something is very revolutionary or new, there were lots of critics from the people, also from the artists and architects, and they were protesting in the name of the French good taste and in the spirit of French culture. They told so. And there were some people, some scientists. They said they calculated 300 meters are much too high. It can't work, and it will destroy. And so be careful. It should not be like this. But the reality was different, and everybody knows the Eiffel Tower is one of the famous landmarks of Paris. Everybody who think about Paris is thinking about the Eiffel Tower, and when you are going to a souvenir shop, you can buy lots of little Eiffel Towers. So the Eiffel Tower is very famous, maybe the most famous building in Paris since then. Yeah, there was, of course, also some very interesting exponents. For example, the Edison photograph. Sorry, the Edison photograph was a kind of wax cylinder, and on the wax cylinder, there were with a wax cylinder he transported music pieces. So the visitors could see or could listen to this music, and you can see here is one man who has a kind of speaker and who could take it. And this was also typical for that time, when the exponents have been first like dead figures. No? So you can watch it and say, wow, how amazing, it was big or something like this. And at that time it started moving, so everybody could take these exponents. They were kind of interactive exponents, so everybody could try it and so on. And this was very characteristic for that time and for the change of the world exhibitions. Another exponent was a slide and water rail by Girard. So it was a kind of railway or a kind of ship, and but this was not steel. It was running off a slide of water, so it was like a riverboat or something like this. And this was also typical. So it was nothing to watch. They could go inside and make a tour and something like this. In the next periods, there were before the First World War. Lots of world exhibitions in Chicago, Antwerpen, Brussels, Paris, St. Louis, Lüttich or Liège in France, Brussels and Ghent. And very interesting was the world exhibition in Chicago, because in general the world exhibition were also used by some scientific subjects. They wanted to get to show that they are independent, that they have their own identity. And for example, the anthropology and ethnology used the world exhibition to present themselves, their subjects of their research areas. And the exhibits from them was, for example, a complete Samoan village, including the people, including the resistance from the South Sea. Samoa is an island in the South Sea, and they took all of the people of this village to the exhibition hall and showed them what happened. So the people were, of course, very excited, because they never had contact with these people, most of them, most of them. And this was very interesting, and this is very typical that the scientific community used these kind of exposition to show themselves, to present their identity of the subjects. So after the Second World War, there were after the First World War till the Second World War, there were two big expositions, one in Barcelona 1929 and one in Chicago in 1933. And there was another change, so all the pavilions of the nations were at that time dominated by expositions of big companies. Mostly at that time the biggest company were from the automobile industry. So for example in Chicago Ford presented a whole production line of Ford. So they built the production line, and they produced inside of the exhibition halls every 10 minutes one Ford, and at the end of the exposition there were 44,000 Ford produced just in this exposition hall. And this was typical that they used these kind of exhibitions to this identification of the nation also for marketing affairs. This is pretty new at that moment. So let's have a detailed look to the Chicago exposition at 1933. The slogan of this exposition was "A Century of Progress," and there were again some new aspects. So at the beginning, it was every nation present themselves, and now there was a kind of staging of the event, a stage event. With the dynamization of the presentations I showed you, but it was getting bigger. There were some halls with interactive medias, and so there were light shows, and the people have to move. They not only watched and walked again or continue walking. No, it was just a kind of dramaturgy. This was very typical for that time, and for example, they made a very, the organizers of the Chicago exposition made a very big opening event. And this opening event was full of symbols. I told you that the first expo in Chicago was at 1893. And in the opening event in 1933, the expo was illuminated by the energy of the star Arcturus. Arcturus, nobody knows it, I didn't know it before as well. But Arcturus is a star. The distance between the Arcturus and the Earth is exactly 40 light years. So the light which illuminated the expo was sent exactly 40 years before, so it was produced by Arcturus at the first expo in Chicago. So you can see lots of symbols were very important for this big event and this big installation. Here is the telescope, the big telescope that focused the light of Arcturus. I'm sure, I don't know, but I'm sure it was not really so focused that the energy was big enough to light a big show, but they showed it as a symbol that they took the light, they collected the light, and then they showed the light of the star illuminated the event. The exponents were all also more and more like a show. For example, they showed a Lilliputian village with 60 Lilliputians. There was a Hollywood stage with live shows and 3D movies. And the German, they didn't attend to the expo directly, but they sent the airship Graf Zeppelin, and the Zeppelin flew over the Michigan Lake and sent some greetings to the show. This was very typical. The show character was very important and very typical at that event. And another very famous explanation was there was a so-called sky ride, and they brought the people to the exposition area. This exposition area was an artificial half island in the Michigan Lake. And another very interesting and this central part of this exposition was the Hall of Science. So the Hall of Science there was presented some scientific topics. For example, how do sound waves arise, or how does a steam machine work? Bacteriological science of Louis Pasteur was shown by the Institut Louis Pasteur in Paris, and the discovery of the tuberculosis bacillus was shown by the Robert Koch Institute of Berlin, and many, many more. So it was very interesting that at that time America discovered that it's very important to embed the science into a story, to show it to the people, that it can understand it, that the people get infected of it. So one of the organizers, James Weber-Lin, said these words: "This will be memorable as the impression that science can be a highly dramatic and poetic imagination, which is the driving force behind scientific research." So it's very interesting that he understood that science to present it in a good way, in an exciting way, might be embedded in a story, in a very good story. There should be a little drama. That this is make it easy to understand, to be understood by the public. And on the other side, one of the aims should of course be that the people, especially young people, are so excited that they say, okay, physics might be a subject I would like to study. And so it's a kind of marketing, of course, but it's very interesting that the American people understood this at that time, because in Germany they discovered this kind of aspect in the year of 2000, so nearly 70 years later. And so they were much more progressive in that sense. And sometimes you can, when you compare, for example, German science books and English science books or American science books, you can see it. All the science books are telling also stories. It's a kind of entertainment, you understand. It's made easier to learn these subjects than, for example, in German. German are writing very precisely, but sometimes in a very dry form, so it's sometimes a little bit boring to read it or hard to read it. So several years later, another expo happened in New York, and there was the Salon, the World of Tomorrow. This expo was not attended by so many nations because it was the start of the Second World War. But the central building they built up was the so-called Triangle and Perisphere. It was a kind of globe. You can see here, and a kind of triangle, and they were connected together. And inside of this globe, there was a kind of futuristical exhibition called Democracy. It's a world of megacities with progressive and connected transport systems and so on. And so the theme of science fiction was very important at that day. And the most famous exhibit was the Futurama Pavilion of General Motors. So the visitors sat on the mobile seats with speakers, and they were introduced to the world of America in 1960. So this was in the future at that time, of course. So here's an impression of it. So they sat around this, and they turned around, and here was the exhibition of skyscrapers and very, very new and futuristic situations like street and traffic systems and so on. And you see all the people were very excited. And it was so popular that there were the people waited for to come inside for sometimes more than one day in front of the house to get in. Yeah, this was also a very exciting exhibition. The first, let's say, Skype was founded at that time. It's a kind of video telephony. Someone could telephone, and it was opened by Charles Kettering. Charles Kettering was the vice president of the development department of General Motors. So, and he was speaking to the audience. It was a very exciting moment. For us, it's a very normal workaday tool, I think, Skype. But at that time, it's very interesting that they had Skype as well at that time. Yeah, after the Second World War, there was, of course, because of the World War, a lack of nearly 10 years. The next after the Second World War was in Brussels, 1958. After it in Moscow, then in Seattle, Lausanne, New York, Montreal, and Osaka. And in Brussels, there was the theme balance of a human world. So the organizers wanted to demonstrate that it's possible to have peace among all nations, because of course it was a kind of nation. Everybody was completely tired about wars. They lost lots of people, and so they wanted to show peace among all nations if possible, and they want also again to create the belief also to ensure the belief in the technological process in innovative art and designs, and of course very important at that time in the general optimism. And Brussels had also, like, not as famous as the Eiffel Tower, but they also created a very interesting building, the so-called Atomium. It's still still there, it's the landmark of Brussels now. The Atomium is a building with different globes, and in every globe there was a single exhibition, and they were connected by moving stairs. Inside it was very interesting. For example, one of the single exhibition was an installation by a composer, a modern composer, and the installation was talking about the nuclear bomb. Yeah, after that, I want to say the decade of space technology started. So it was the beginning of the Cold War between Russia, or the Soviet Union, and USA, and all the exhibitions were more influenced by propaganda than by serious sciences, and lots of visitors were very badly disappointed and said, this is not that what we want. We want to present serious sciences and so on. So, and both sides shows their progress in space technology. There started a running competition who is faster in the space technology. It's, this was very typical for the next expositions. For example, in Moscow, the brochure had the title of the Sputnik capsule at the cover of the brochure. Or inside, in Seattle, the main attraction was the space adventure by Ford. It was a 30-meter-long spaceship, and visitors could contain projections of planets, satellites, moon, and of the Mars. A picture here of it. It's very interesting that there's only a picture with pretty old people. It looks like it was only attended by old people, but I'm sure it was also very exciting for young people. But you can see they sat like in a spaceship or in the bus, and they watch outside, and there were some presentations of planets and spaceships and something like this. Yeah, in New York, 1964, there was an astronaut who flew over the enthusiastic visitors during the demonstration of the rocket engine by the company Bell Aviation. And yeah, it looks a little bit like James Bond, I think, but it's real. It was a real show, and it worked. It seemed to work. So it was very interesting. These kind of exhibits were very typical. Or in Osaka, there were some astronauts floating in the space with a capsule. Of course, this is not true. This is a dummy, but the decoration is typical for that time. Okay, in Osaka there was another big change. The slogan of Osaka was "Progress and Harmony for Mankind." So it fits a little bit to that time. So it was the start of the flower power generation in 1968, and harmony was a big theme, of course, around the world. And the technical and cultural exhibit didn't dominate that exposition. It was more an installation with movies, lights, sounds, and illusion cabinets. So the World Fair was absolutely dominated by games, lots of entertainments, pleasure, cultural performances, and there were some competitions between the nations. For example, Germany brought Herbert von Karajan and the Berlin Philharmonic Orchestra. Great Britain organized a concert with the Beatles. There was a a show of the Bolshoi Ballet and Afghan folk group. So the most typical thing at that time was to show, to present entertainment to the world. So the criticism where the whole exhibition looked more like an Olympic game of entertainment and less like an exhibition in which the world present their technology. This was, of course, some critics they told, but it's typical for that time. I think the technology of broadcast equipment and so on arise, and this is, of course, also a kind of a technical presentation. Yeah, after that, from let's say 67 till 2002, energy and environment was a big theme appeared in the various exhibits. So lots of nations present a peaceful use of nuclear energy, or later of renewable energies and ecological themes, and you can see it on some slogans. So in Montreal 1967, the USSR presented a very colorful model of a nuclear reactor in their pavilion, and they wanted to demonstrate the peaceful use of nuclear energy. And when we see the later slogans of all the following expositions, in Knoxville the slogan was "Energy Move the World." In New Orleans the theme was "The World of Rivers, Fresh Water as a Source of Life." In Lisbon, the oceans, heritage for the future. And in Hanover 2000, the slogan "Humans, Nature and Techniques." So you can see the theme energy, renewable energies, or how the theme, the question how can we save the world was very important at that time. And so according to that, the environmental technology dominated lots of pavilions. So let's have a little or a detailed summary of that, what we have seen. So in contrast to ordinary trade fairs, for example, the world exhibitions at the beginning did not only be understood as a show of economic performances. They wanted to be more mediators of science and education. So the form to present themselves changed. It was not only a show who is bigger, who is faster, who is louder, or something like this. It was more a close connection between science and education. So it was very close to the media strategies to other educational and cultural institutions, such as schools and museums. It was more a museum, I think I would say, than a trade fair. And the stimulus of education already existed in London at the beginning. So artisans and entrepreneurs should be able to study advanced products of the rivals. This was expected. And the public should be trained in their knowledge and taste. So, of course, there was lots of marketing aspects as well in these kind of museums or exposition. And at the beginning, the technique was initially presented in the form of immovable machines, I told you before, and should only be noticed that it's very big and very amazing or something like this. But later, the pure machineries was no longer sufficient, so there should be more larger context. So it was much more embedded in a big story, in a whole event, in a kind of dramaturgy, and not just good positioning in terms of light, space, and point of view was important. It was the object was arranged in a way that they communicate a message, a big message, for example. And in addition to that, they produced handouts like brochures and magazines they could give to the people, that they could search what is interesting for them, and to take it to home as a souvenir and so on. Yeah, and in the 20th century, the exhibits became more mobile, and the companies arranged completely production. I told you about the car production of Henry Ford, and in addition to that, there was a tire factory in operation. They produced tires in the exposition hall, Firestone in Chicago, for example, and they showed the textile processing machineries, and these things were very important at the beginning of the 20th century. And it was, of course, the end of the immobile audiences. They only get entertained by watching. No, it was very important that the visitors were active, an active part. They should start exhibits with a fingerprint, with a fingertip, and so on. This was very important, that they could do something, like this. No? And this is very typical for some concepts in the modern world. So at that time, now I finished the concept to introduce you the concept of world exhibitions, and there were in the modern time there are some new technical museums. They overtook these concepts, so-called science centers. So in science centers, it was also very important that everybody who visits it could do something. Learning by doing is a very big and important aspect. For example, here are some aspects that kids they have some 3D glasses on it, and they should discover how is it possible to distinguish the colors of the balls. Here they could build something. It was a kind of laboratory. They could research in a hall, different hall organized by some teachers or something like this. This is very similar to the concept of the world exhibition. And I want to show you two examples from Germany, two science centers. One is in the Universum in Bremen. So it's also very interesting hall. This hall looks a little bit like a whale or like an oyster or something like this. And inside of this hall, there are three, let's say, departments. One for human affairs, one for you could see something about the earthquakes and something like this. For example, you sit on the sofa and you feel how much is on the Richter scala, earthquake 7 or something like this. They can feel it. And another department for the whole university, universe, where you can see something about the cosmos and so on. And another science center is the Pheno in Wolfsburg. Wolfsburg is a pretty small town, but famous town near Hanover. Wolfsburg is the town where the headquarters of Volkswagen. And it's Pheno is a very interesting building. By the way, it's built up by the architect Zahra Hadid. Zahra Hadid is an Iraqi woman. And the philosophy of that building is of course also learning by doing. And I want to show you some content of it. It's on German, so I don't show you the sound, but how it works inside. Perhaps we can start a little bit later. This is an official movie. It's introduced by a little robot, and he shows his favorite subject. And here you can, for example, see an exponent where you can produce cloud rings together. All together, press on this cube. So it's very important to be a kind of a little researcher. Or for example, here there are some cubes, and they should build a bridge without any other materials. It's very interesting to learn something about architecture. This was, of course, I think the most funny things to destroy that. Or for example, how can it be that fakirs can sleep on nails? For example, it will be explained. There are lots of nails, and why doesn't it hurt? This is also a very interesting question for the people and so on. So the concept of all these exponates, like in the world exhibitions, is that everybody can feel the knowledge. That they don't learn it by listening to it, that they feel it, that they are learning by doing. This was very important for all of the exhibits in the World Expo, and this was the idea that they were adopted by the science centers as well. So I'm at the end of my presentation now, and if you have some questions or some discussions, I would be happy if you would discuss with me. Thank you very much.
Very beneficial, thank you.
Thank you very much.
I have learned a lot through what you have told us in this presentation.
Thank you. Yeah, this is
How the basics change.
right, yeah. And this kind of development you also can see in museums, for example, science museums or like this. For example, if you compare some ethnological museums where you can see maybe some dinosaurs, so it's very, very, very amazing. But all the organizers of some museums thought it's much better when you have some interactive moments. These themes, the interactive moment is very important for all communication affairs. And this is only one part of the research I make. For example, stage events, how to present science is a very big theme, and I'm sure that might be a very big theme in Turkey as well. Because in Germany we started with science communication at the beginning of 2000, because there was a dramatical lack of students. They wanted to study physics, so all the players for politics and science and economy had to think about the concept. How can we manage it that the young people get more excited about physics, for example? And the science centers were some of these subjects, they are very important, or to make some events that all the professors are going to the street and explaining it to the ordinary people, for example. So we manage, for example, some exhibitions in a store, in a mall. So all the professors stood in the mall and explaining it to the people. They only wanted to buy, for example, a shirt at CNA, and they came and said, "Oh, what's that?" And then the professors explained it. This is very, very interesting. Was a very interesting event and experience for the professors as well, because they got the contact to the ordinary people, not only to the students. They could imagine, understand what is interesting for them, what is the question they have, and or where is the barrier, for example. Sometimes people think it's very, I would like to study physics, but it's much too difficult. I can't do it. I will lose it and so on. This is very important to reduce the barrier, that they feel, okay, I try it. Yeah, I try it. And for that, the contact between professors and ordinary people was very important in Germany. And after we created these events, the professors were very surprised and said, "This is so great. It was so nice. I like it very much to talk with the people." And so the understanding how to present science in the public get better and better. This is a very interesting experience I made, and I'm very happy about it.
Must not be a coincidence. She still learns by doing.
Yeah. That's right. You're welcome.
Nerede işte ama bizim